Well, guys, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Kevin LaRue with SlickPick, and I'm joined by my colleague Sam Burson. And our guest of honor today is Ian Plant. You're in the SlickPick Academy, and thanks again for being here. We've got a wonderful topic here for you today. But before we get started, if you don't know Ian's story, he's a world-renowned photographer. He's shot, as you can tell, all over the world. We were just talking about Rwanda. And he's the founder of PhotoMaster, which is a great membership group if you want to learn more about photography and just get inspired by Ian's work and the work of the collective, I guess you'd say. So he's been a speaker at some of the Kelby One Live conferences, most recently the On One Travel Photography Conference. So I think that was probably a pretty good fit and choice by them. But he's also authored dozens of books, and his work has appeared in a number of photographic magazines, including Outdoor Photographer over the years. So I really don't want to do much more of a setup on this topic. I know we're going to be talking about underwater photography today, Ian, and I can't wait to learn along with the rest of the group here about your adventures down in Mexico. Why don't you take it away?
Fantastic. Thank you, Kevin, for agreeing to host me here, and thank you all for joining me. I'm not going to be sharing my screen, so if you need to see me bigger, you should maximize the Zoom window on your own end. But I will be sharing my presentation and some other goodies, so you'll definitely want to see it as big as you possibly can. And so I was recently down in Baja California, which is in Mexico. And I have to explain that to people because some people think that Baja California means it's in California in the United States, but no, it's in Mexico. And I was there to do some underwater photography. Now, I've done some underwater photography in the past, but it is mostly new to me. And so I didn't realize how much I was diving into the deep end of the pool with this trip, so to speak, pardon the pun. But I was doing underwater photography in open ocean environments, and I was in the water with what can best be described as giant sea wolves. So my primary target was to photograph orcas, which are misleadingly known as killer whales because they're not actually whales, they're porpoises, but they're very big porpoises. And these are one of the apex predators of the sea. And so I was there to photograph killer whales. Now, I wasn't diving, I was snorkeling with the whales. And it was an incredible experience. All the underwater creatures that I got a chance to photograph, including the killer whales, but other things as well. And it was also an intense experience of what I said earlier about diving into the deep end of the pool with this trip is that unbeknownst to me, I wasn't just jumping in the water and then snorkeling around for a while, having this kind of calm encounter with underwater wildlife. Instead, we were rushing constantly. So we're in the boat, we're looking for interesting species to photograph. But a lot of these species, like orcas and other whales and porpoises, they are constantly on the move. And so when you find them, the boat has to get in front of them so we can intercept them. And then you've got to jump in the water as the animals are swimming by. And they're not stopping, they just keep going. And so you're in the water for 30 seconds and it's this mad dash. You jump in, you're surrounded by water and bubbles. You can't see anything for the first few seconds. And finally, your vision clears. And then you're looking for the animal that you're trying to photograph coming out of the gloom. And then you finally see it if you're lucky, because sometimes it decides to go left, sometimes it decides to go right. It doesn't always decide to go right by you. And so sometimes you're lucky and you actually see it. And then you got to swim like crazy to try to get in a position that you want to be in to make the photograph before it goes by. And then you're back on the boat and the boat's going back around so you could do it all over again. And so it was incredibly physically demanding. But I did learn a lot from this trip. I had a lot of fun. I'd done some underwater photography before, so I wasn't completely inexperienced, but starting off with something that was very challenging forces you to learn very quickly. So I'm going to share some of the images that I took when I was photographing underwater in Baja and some of the lessons that I learned. So if you're interested in getting into underwater photography yourself, there are going to be some interesting insights in this presentation. All right, so my underwater gear, just to start off with, I was photographing with a Sony A7R5 camera, which is really more optimized as a landscape camera. It's a big 60 megapixel camera. But I liked having that underwater because it actually shoots fast enough in terms of frames per second that I could keep up with the action. It does up to 10 frames per second, which is really, really good for any type of wildlife. A lot of the newer mirrorless cameras will give you like 30 or 50 frames per second, which is just absolutely insane. But 10 frames per second used to be the gold standard in wildlife photography, and it's really good. And so the lens I was using was a Tamron 16 to 30 millimeter lens. And I was using this at 16 millimeters. So I was going pretty wide. And that was really useful because most of the time I was getting pretty close to the underwater wildlife that I was photographing. And also, if the wildlife came close to you and it's very big, you definitely want to have that wide angle view. And so I had some dual Delkin devices, black CF Express Type A media cards, so that I could always keep up with the action. And these are very fast media cards. So no matter how many frames per second I'm shooting, I am never actually running out of space on my card. The cards are able to keep up and I don't have to stop shooting. And I was using an Icolite underwater camera housing to protect the camera and the lens and everything else. And of course, then I had my snorkeling equipment, a mask, snorkel fins, and a rash guard, which is basically a thin wetsuit, just to give me a little extra warmth, even though the water was pretty warm, and to protect me from like stinging jellyfish and stuff like that. So pretty basic equipment, actually, nothing super fancy. And there are essentially three ways to do underwater photography. And so the first way is snorkeling. Snorkeling is the easiest one to do. Anyone who can doggy paddle, anyone who can just barely swim can snorkel. And it's very simple. There's no extra training that you need, but you're also always at the top of the water. And so you can only photograph wildlife that is at the near the top of the water as well. Another way is to do scuba diving, which allows you to get down lower under the water. So you can photograph species that are farther down, or you can get down below species that are up near the surface of the water. But of course, scuba diving requires all sorts of advanced equipment and learning. So it's very technical. And then finally, there is a compromise between the two, which is called free diving. And so free diving is basically snorkeling, but you just dive underwater and you go down deep and you hold your breath for as long as you can before you come back up. And so free diving is in many ways, I think, the ultimate way to do most underwater photography because you've got the flexibility to go down lower if you can, and then come back up quickly. So if you're scuba diving and you go down low, then you have to slowly reascend to prevent getting the bends. And so that's not as much of a concern with free diving. Of course, with free diving, you can't go down as deep as most scuba divers can go, and you can't go down for anywhere near as long. And so it could be a bit more dangerous as well because you're just holding your breath that whole time. But it does give you the flexibility to go in deeper if you need to. If you're photographing an animal and it's below you, for example, it's not swimming near the surface, you can dive down. And so free diving is something that I think everyone can kind of do naturally. If you know how to swim, you know how to free dive, but the devil is in the details. You want to learn how to do free diving right, to do it the proper way so it's not dangerous. And you also have to build up your physical tolerance for it. So it's not something you can just be like, oh, okay, I'm going to free dive down to 100 feet below the water and hang out there for 2 minutes. You got to do a lot of practice and training to be able to do that safely. And I am not a free diver, or at least not officially, just a bit of an anecdote. One of the crew members on the boat I was on asked me if how deep can you free dive? And I said, oh, no, I don't really know how to free dive. And then I was doing some snorkeling where I was just in an area where there was a lot of fish. And I was snorkeling by myself for about an hour. And I was diving down under the water to try to get closer to some of the fish that were lower down. And when I get back on the boat, that same crew member said, Ian, I thought you said you didn't know how to free dive, but I saw you going down like 30 feet, 40 feet below the water. You obviously know how to free dive. And I'm like, no, not really. I wasn't really free diving. I was just going underwater. I wasn't really doing it necessarily the right way. It's easy enough to do, but I'm not really well practiced in it. And so I'm actually trying to get better at it because I very quickly realized that freediving was really the way to make some amazing photographs underwater. And so here actually is a video of me doing a little bit of freediving. I didn't go down very deep for this particular shot. I was photographing this eagle ray as it was going by. And so I trained for several months and dieted just to make sure that I would look good in a wetsuit for this video. So I should have spent that time practicing my freediving skills instead of worrying about how my body would look in a wetsuit. I'm just kidding, actually. Um, but yeah, wetsuits are great because they're black, which is naturally slimming, and they sort of they're kind of tight, so they just take all the squishy parts and they make it look a lot nicer. So freediving is definitely the way to go. So when you're making underwater photos, one thing that you need to think about is water quality. And so underwater photographers generally divide water quality into two different buckets. One is blue water, where you've got clear conditions, and so you've got this dominant blue-green tint in the water. And then there's green water, which is murkier conditions. You've got algae or other sediment in the water, and the water looks much more green or can even have a brown cast. And so related to this water quality issue is something called backscatter. And that is when there's particulates in the water and you're using a flash underwater to try to illuminate a subject, and it hits all those particulates and the light is reflected back. But you could also get backscatter just from natural light. So if there's particulates in the water and there's some sunlight coming in, those particulates can kind of light up if the sun is coming in at the right angle. And so you got to be thinking about the water clarity a lot when you're making underwater photos. And water clarity interacts with the quality of the light that's coming in. So if you're photographing on a sunny day, you might get really gorgeous color and light if you're in blue water conditions. You'll get these beautiful sunbeams in the water, and the subjects will be illuminated by this really nice light. But if it's a cloudy day, for example, even if you're in blue water, the light quality might not be that good. And if you're in green water, it kind of doesn't really matter because the murkiness of the water is blocking a lot of the light anyways. So you're always thinking about water quality and how the quality of the light will interact with that water quality. And so here's an example of a green water shot that I took. My very first encounter with orcas was in green water. And that made it a bit challenging because it was hard to see the animals. And so this mother and her infant came by me. I barely had time to react because I couldn't see them in the gloom. And then all of a sudden, bam, they were there right in front of me, swimming right past me. And they were very close. I was glad that I had that wide angle lens because I almost wasn't able to fit them within the image frame. And you can see the green water here really reduces the image quality and the clarity of the final shot. Now, don't get me wrong, I can sometimes like green water shots, especially if you've got a little bit of sunlight coming in and some of the particulates are backlit. There is sort of a dreamy look, kind of a low contrast look that can be magical in the right circumstances. But generally, what you want is blue water. You can definitely see the change in image quality. So this is a photograph I made of a sea turtle, and sea turtles are a lot of fun to photograph. They are just very relaxed and chill. You know, sometimes you'll find sea turtles that don't mind if you swim with them, and they can even be very, very curious. And they're beautiful, graceful animals. I love photographing sea turtles when I can because it's just such a nice photo experience. You can take your time with them. You can be more deliberate. You can think critically about what you're doing, thinking about the composition and the creative use of the light. But having that blue water, you got that really strong light on the animal, and you start getting those sunbeams coming down. And with a wide angle lens, those beams get bent to form diagonal lines. So they add a lot of really nice perspective to your photographs. And so the settings I was using when I'm making these photos, my focal length, as I mentioned earlier, was 16 millimeter. I wanted to go wide just in case anything big came in close. And there were times when I wanted to be even wider than that, but you know, it's not easy to switch lenses when you've got it in the housing. You have to get out of the water, you got to dry the housing off, you got to take the housing off, you got to switch the lens, you've got to put the housing back together, then you've got to pressurize the housing before you're ready to go back into the water. And if you're on a boat that's bouncing in the waves, going from one spot to another, there might be some spray coming over. And when you've got the housing open, that means there might be some spray getting in the housing. It's not something you want to do. So generally, you want to have everything set up with your camera housing, and you don't want to change it at all while you're on the water. And so the aperture I was using for my shots was typically f8, and that was giving me a little bit extra depth of field. So, like for example, this is a photograph of a silky shark that I made, and the tail of the shark is much farther away than the head of the shark. So that extra depth of field ensures that the entire shark is in focus. And my shutter speed would range from 1/200th of a second to about 1/500th of a second. And so usually I was shooting 1/500th because there would often be these encounters with wildlife that were moving very quickly. So I wanted to make sure I had a short enough shutter speed to freeze the action so that the animal wasn't blurred. And a lot of times the animals weren't moving that fast, but they might randomly just speed up. And so you wanted to be in a position to capture them if they suddenly sped up. And so usually I was shooting at 1/500th of a second, even if when I first got in the water, the animals seemed pretty chill and weren't moving very quickly. And I just kept my white balance on auto, let the camera pick a white balance. And so when you're shooting raw images, you can change your white balance later when you're processing the photo without any penalty. There's no degradation of image quality when you change your white balance. So there's no reason to be deciding before you're shooting what your white balance is. You might as well just make that decision later. And so I also used auto ISO because light conditions would often change frequently. So if the animal was near the surface, there's a lot more light there. But if it's a little bit deeper, it's much darker there, and the light has a tougher time penetrating the water than it does the air. So there would often be wild variations in the amount of light. And so auto ISO would keep up with that. Another thing you can do is use ISO invariance. A lot of the newer digital cameras are agnostic when it comes to increasing your ISO or keeping your ISO lower and underexposing the image and then increasing the exposure later. And what I mean by that is that the noise you get, the digital noise you get, is the same. So if you need ISO 3200, for example, to get an image, then you're going to get a lot of noise from using that higher ISO. If your camera is ISO invariant, then if you keep your ISO at 600 instead of going up to 3200, the image will be underexposed. But then in the processing phase, if you increase the exposure, you'll end up with noise that's no different than if you had shot it at 3200. So why would you want to do this? Why would you want to use that lower ISO and underexpose the image and then increase the exposure later? Well, the only reason to do it really, other than, otherwise you would use ISO, auto ISO, the only reason to do to do ISO invariance is if you've got highlights that might get overexposed if you increase your ISO. So if by increasing your ISO to 3200, there's a little bit of bright light on the animal that ends up being overexposed, you can't recover that detail later. So the overall exposure is proper, looks good, but you've got these highlights that have been clipped and you can't recover them. So if you shoot at the lower ISO and intentionally underexpose your image, then you can pull up the general exposure, but preserve the detail in those highlights. So if you don't know anything about ISO invariance, don't worry about it. It's really not that important to know it. You can just get by using auto ISO for stuff like this, and there's really not much of a reason to learn about ISO invariance, but it is helpful to know about it if you are working with contrasty subjects and there might be highlights that you're afraid of blowing out. So if that's the circumstance you're in, learn something about ISO invariance. First, find out if your camera supports it, because not all cameras do. But most of the newer mirrorless cameras support ISO invariance.
Hey,
Okay, yeah.
Ian, I just want to jump in with a couple things, in particular on that last slide. So, first of all, thanks for. I had never heard of the term ISO invariance before. I'm hoping that my older XT4 can do a firmware upgrade and somehow get it. But no, that was interesting to hear about highlight clipping and how this might minimize it. So I had two questions. Number one, what did you mean earlier by pressurizing the housing? You had said it in the context of sort
Yeah.
of the dangers of having to change a lens, midstream there. But what is pressurizing the housing if you're free diving less than 30 feet? Why would it need to be pressurized?
Yeah, if you're not going particularly deep, you probably don't have to worry about pressurization. But pressurization is a good thing generally, and
How
is
do you
something
do
that
it?
you should always do when you're using an underwater housing,
Mhm.
because the pressure when you basically you pump air through a valve into the housing. So the air goes
Oh,
in but doesn't come out. And part of the reason to do that is to test to make sure that the housing is assembled correctly, that you don't have a leak. Because if the air is leaking out, that means water can leak in.
right.
And another thing that the pressure does is it tightens the seals. So it might actually prevent a leak. It doesn't just warn you of a leak, it will prevent a potential leak.
Oh,
And so obviously, the deeper you go, the more pressure there is from the outside on the housing. And so having more pressure inside to equalize that is good. And you're right, if you're not going very deep, you probably don't have to worry about pressurization as much. But
but
I
your
still
your
think it's a good
comment
idea.
about testing for leaks is a very valid one. So
Yeah.
yeah, that to me would trump everything. And just one quick question on this image. I love the rays of light in the background. And can you tell me about the striping or the light on the fish here?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a silky shark. And in this video, you could see that silky sharks, their native skin color is just kind of a flat gray, brownish gray. And so the striping you see on the shark here is just from the light coming through the
Wow.
water. And the
Okay.
waves are creating shadows. And
Okay.
so that's why you got this really interesting pattern. And it's kind of weird because it almost looks like a projector is
Right.
playing a movie on the shark, which is the screen, because the light just changes as the waves are moving. And it
Okay.
also makes the projected light on the shark is not sharp. It's because it doesn't have any real sharpness to it. It's just basically if you think of a wave as a really poor quality camera lens, you're projecting the light through that poor quality lens, and so the projected image isn't very sharp, and so it's kind of creates this cognitive dissonance where
Right.
the outlines of the shark are perfectly sharp, but the pattern of the light and shadow on the shark looks a little out of focus. It's just kind of weird, but that's just the way it is.
Just the natural phenomena. That's
Yeah.
it was a stunning little picture, and I'm like, wow, how did it's almost like he masked the pattern on the shark, but I'm glad you explained it in terms of the waves and the light and the
Yeah.
diffusion, I guess.
Yeah, it's
Thank
like you're
thank
watching the most boring movie playing on the most interesting screen you've ever seen.
right. Great way.
Yeah, and so just about ISO invariance. So if you've got an older camera, like a software update for the camera, a firmware update isn't going to give you ISO invariance. It's kind of built into the sensor technology.
Gotcha.
But most of the newer mirrorless cameras are ISO invariant. And I tell people, for most things, you don't have to worry about ISO invariance because by definition, it means it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you use a higher ISO or underexpose the image with a lower ISO and then boost the exposure when you're processing the image. You're going to end up with the same noise either way. It advantageous when you've got bright highlights that might get overexposed with that higher ISO. So
Mhm.
for some wildlife photography, I think it can be useful. Some people who do a lot of star, like Milky Way photography, find it to be useful to avoid having the stars get overexposed. But for most people, you don't have to worry about it.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. And so I talked a little bit about photographing sea turtles. This was one turtle that I spent some time with And this dude was really chill. He was actually very curious. This turtle would swim right up to me. And I found out later that part of why they do that is they see their reflection in the dome port of the camera housing and they think it's another turtle. So he was coming over to say hi. Actually, I think it might have been mating season, so I think he was looking for something else. But in any event, this turtle wasn't bothered by me at all. As a matter of fact, he would swim up to me, get very close. He would, it was hard to get away from him. There was times when I'm trying to swim backwards to get a little distance so I could get the composition I wanted, and that turtle wanted to just be right on me. And it was a great experience though, because of all the experiences I had on this trip, this was the one where I was able to slow down and be the most deliberate in my choices of composition and the creative use of light and capturing the magic of the moment. And so I was just able to slow down and think about it. A lot of times you don't have time to think. You don't even have time to put the camera to your eye. It's a little bit difficult when the camera's in the housing and you're wearing a snorkeling mask to actually get your eye to the viewfinder. Um, and when the action's happening really quick, sometimes you're just putting the camera in front of you and guessing at the proper angle to get the shot that you want. So with the turtle, I was able to slow down a bit, and that was a lot of fun. Another species that was a pretty chill encounter was manta rays. Manta rays are absolutely beautiful. They are graceful. This is a video I shot of this particular ray that I photographed. They often move slowly, so it's easy to sort of keep up with them. And they do these loop-de-loops where they flip upside down, and you can see this kind of ghostly face on the bottom of the animal. And they're just so weird looking. They look like nothing else. Very alien. And so often you can swim with them for a long period of time. They don't seem bothered by people at all. And it's another species where you can kind of slow down and be a little bit more deliberate in your approach. And so I worked with this particular manta for, I don't know, probably about 20 or 30 minutes before it swam off and disappeared. And so I got all sorts of different shots. This one was beneath me where it had flipped over to show me the ghost face. And I really liked, just basically the patterns on the water, on the land down below and some of the light beams going in. But this manta was pretty deep below me, so the water quality falls off very, very quickly. And this shot, the manta was in shallower water. So the water quality was better all the way down to the bottom of the ocean floor. And another species encounter that I had was with a pod of false killer whales. So false killer whales are another big porpoise species, not quite as big as orcas. And they have a white patch on their face, their head. So that's why they're called false killer whales, but they don't really have that same patch pattern that orcas have. And so this particular pod was on the move. And so I did a few jumps with them where I'm just going in the water very quickly, hoping that I'll see them. And so multiple jumps is the key in these encounters because they happen so quickly. It's really, really hard to know where the animals are going to be, where they're going, and to make sure you're in the right position for it. I felt like 2 or 3 times in a row, I would be having bad luck. I'd go in, there was a few other people on my boat who were jumping in with me, and it always seemed like someone else was in the best place for the animal. And it's easy to get really frustrated, but then I'd do a jump where suddenly I'm the one that's in the best place to get the photographs. And so this encounter actually slowed down and sped up simultaneously. It slowed down because the whales stopped moving at one point. And the reason why was they were hunting this big fish, this wahoo that's in this picture. And so the pod was hunting this wahoo. And I was in the water. There was some other people in the water. There was my boat. There was a few other boats. And there was a bunch of people in the water watching this. And so this went on for about 20 minutes. And so it was kind of fun to watch. It also sped up because the activity was pretty frantic. It was so frantic that it was just kind of impossible to get any photos. You can see below the wahoo, there's a few dark shapes down below. Those are some of the false killer whales. And every now and then they would lunge up to try to get the wahoo, and the wahoo was trying to evade them. And when these whales were down below and they were lunging up towards the surface to go for the wahoo, it just happened so fast. It was hard to get any good photos. Um, and then eventually we realized that the wahoo was using us as shelter. It was basically trying to find a place to hide, and it decided that a bunch of people in the water was a good place. So the boat captains, when they realized this, they pulled everyone out of the water because they don't want to disturb the hunt. They wanted to give the false killer whales a chance to successfully complete the hunt. And it could, I guess, potentially have been dangerous. You know, the false killer whales, they don't want to eat us as people. They don't view us as potential prey. But in a situation like that where they're stimulated, there is always the possibility that they might make a mistake and think they're going for the wahoo instead going for me. And like all the people I was on the boat with, they kept on calling me chum, and I thought they were just being friendly. But I think they had decided that I would be the bait for all the animals because that's just how it goes with me. So I'm glad that we got out of the water and I didn't literally become chum. Not that I was ever really worried about it. You know, as I said, these animals know their business. They know what they're going after. And so there's not really any risk. But every now and then you stop and think to yourself, wow, I was just in the water with nothing separating me between these giant sea wolves that are these really skilled predators. And here I am flopping around in the water out of my comfort zone, out of my natural environment in theirs. What was I thinking? But definitely, it was a lot of fun. I never felt like I was in any danger when I was photographing things like false killer whales or orcas or anything like that. And if there is one species or one group of underwater creatures that does make me nervous being in the water with, that would be sharks. So, of course, I signed up to do a silky shark expedition. And so what the boats do is they go out into areas where the silkies tend to congregate, and then they chum the water. And they keep on chumming the water until the sharks appear. And then you go in the water with the chum and the sharks. Now, silky sharks are relatively small. They're not very big. They're not particularly aggressive. So it's a good shark species to go in the water with. You got to be careful. They tell you, never take your eyes off the sharks. And if the sharks get too close, you put your fins in front of them or you put your camera housing, if you have one like I did, right in front of them. And that usually causes them to back off. So I never really felt like I was in any danger, but it's still a little nerve-wracking swimming with these massive predators. And sharks I think are not quite as smart as something like an orca, and so they're probably more likely to maybe want to take a little test bite to see what you're made of, or to get their signals crossed. So definitely going in the water with sharks is something that you got to be more careful about. But as I said, these aren't particularly big sharks. And so it's relatively safe. And it's not the first time I've been in the water with sharks. I have encountered some sharks when I've been doing some snorkeling or underwater photography in other places like reef sharks in the Galapagos. But definitely silky sharks were kind of a step up the predator chain. They were a little bit bigger and a little bit more aggressive than the other types of sharks I've encountered before. So it was, I was a little nervous about it, but I had a great time. And I photographed some other species. There's sea lions, and sea lions are a lot of fun. They can be very playful, and they often tolerate a close approach by people. And so I was able to do some interesting photography with the sea lions. There were also other types of species, lots and lots of beautiful, colorful fish. So I had opportunities to play around with that. And those were great, like the sea lions and the fish were a lot of fun because I was able to slow down. It's a much more deliberate shooting experience. But I was there, and also this is a photograph of a common dolphin. Dolphins are fun to photograph, but they're tough because they're small relative to orcas or other bigger whales, and they move very, very fast. And so it's really challenging to get photographs of them underwater. They do tend to like to follow the boats, like swim in the wake. And so if you're up above, it's very easy to just, take pictures of them as they're swimming down below. But they're really, really tough to photograph under the water. So that was kind of challenging. But the reason I was there was for the killer whales, the orcas. And I was lucky to have two sightings of killer whales. So I was able to do multiple drops for each sighting. So I got multiple opportunities to get some shots. And the first day was that green water data that I mentioned earlier. But by my second encounter, which was on the fifth day, yeah, the fifth day, I was out in the water for 6 full days. So on day number 5, I had a second encounter, and these whales were in blue water. And so much, much better experience. And I think that of all the photos of the killer whales that I took, this was my favorite right here. This is one whale just come up to the surface to get some air, and it was diving back down. And so I had this wider angle view. So I was bringing in all of the sunbeams coming down on the water, and they just were transformed into these diagonal lines. And that's just creating this really nice leaning in perspective effect that sort of pulls the viewer from the top to the bottom of the image frame. So it just encourages the viewer to explore more of the composition. So I often like taking that wider view when I'm doing wildlife. It's known as an environmental portrait. So you're bringing in more of the environment that they live in to tell more of a story. But I also think it allows you to bring in more interesting compositional elements, which is what I was trying to do here. And when you're underwater, other interesting compositional elements could be other wildlife that they're interacting with, or it could just be the gorgeous light, the sunbeams coming down. I think that's a beautiful compositional element that I'm trying to bring in as much as possible whenever I'm doing underwater photography. And let me just show you a quick video of what it's like doing these jumps. So as I said earlier, this was really challenging. This was one, and I was told by the people I was with, oh yeah, this is some of the most challenging snorkeling you'll ever do. This is really tough because you just have to jump in, move quickly, then get out as quickly as you can, and then keep on repeating it over and over again. And I just really don't have an opportunity to slow down. So this was kind of what it's like. I had a video as I jumped in. And so this is me going in the water, and you could see for the first few seconds, you can't see anything. And so it takes a while to reorient yourself, and you got to be on the move right away. You can't just jump in and float around. You got to get away from the boat because the boat's moving. You don't want to get hit by the boat. You want to go out because if there's anyone else on the boat trying to jump in, they're going to come in after you. So, there was a few times where the person who was coming in after me came in really hot and fast, and I got whacked on the head. So you want to avoid that. So you got to hit the water as you're going under. You're disoriented. You just got to get moving right away, and then you just hope for the best. You hope that you will see the animal, that it will come right by you, and that you can move into position fast enough to get the shot. It was very challenging. There are definitely easier snorkeling and underwater experiences that one can do. So if people are interested in doing this for the first time, I would definitely recommend doing something a lot easier rather than just diving right in and trying to do orca photography. That's really, really challenging. So the truth is I had a whale of a good time, and I'm already planning my next adventure to Baja to do underwater photography. It is the Serengeti of the sea. I was just stunned and amazed by the diversity of wildlife that I encountered and the quality of the photo experiences. So I'm going back in December. So every December, there is what is called the sardine run. So sardines are basically, I guess it's kind of like spawning season. So they're gathering in these big groups so that they can go do their spawning wherever there is. I don't know if sardines swim up rivers like salmon do or whether there's something else is going on, but they congregate and the predators come to hunt them. And the predators round the sardines up into what they call bait balls. So this is when smaller bait fish, this is what the fishermen would call it, when they're afraid of something, they ball up, they get into these very compact schools. Because for any individual fish, that reduces your chances of getting eaten. But it also makes it really easy for the predators to get fish. So if you're an individual fish, schooling, bait balling is a great strategy. But if you are fish collectively, it is open season for the predators. And so striped marlin hunt them. You also, if you're lucky, you might have sea lions hunting these sardines. You might have, larger, dolphins and porpoises. You might have orcas. You might even have bigger whales that are coming in they're not feeding necessarily on the sardines, but they might be feeding on other things. So I'm going to be back there in December to do that, and I'm hoping to get some amazing underwater photographs. I'm going to be practicing my free diving as much as can. Unfortunately, I live in Minnesota, and during the summer, a lot of the lakes have got an algae bloom, and so I can free dive practice in the lakes. I just can't see anything when I'm underwater. So,
That's fantastic. My wife and I went to Baja last year, and we took a
mm,
little snorkeling boat out, not to do underwater photography, but I have an appreciation for like open water snorkeling and how rough it can be.
mm.
When you're trying to get out of the boat and into the boat. In fact, I had a question. When you were coming back up to the boat, were you handing your camera to somebody on there as you were getting back in?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
So they
So
had,
on the boat, there was always a captain and a guide.
okay.
And so they were always ready to grab the camera. Just they know how difficult it is
Yeah.
coming back in. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you arrange a trip like this? I mean, it sounded like there were multiple boats. Do you just go on Google and say snorkel photo expedition?
Yes,
Okay.
literally. You just go and search, like orca snorkeling, and they
Okay.
come
There you
up.
go.
There's a number of tour operators that offer this. I did some research to find the one that I thought was going to give me the best photo opportunities. It was a company that was run by a woman who does underwater photography,
Oh,
and
there
so
you
I
go.
picked that one. But like you can like literally go down to Cabo in Baja, go to the marina, and hire like they're just tons of captains that have got boats.
Right.
And you can just talk with, sometimes they set up booths that will say, hey, come swim with silky sharks. And I kind of did after I did the orca thing. I just
Mhm.
hung out in Cabo for a few days and went down to the marina and found people to take me out. And it was
Wow.
like,
That's great.
$200 for a 4 or 5 hour trip.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, you want to go photograph silky sharks? We'll take you there. And
Sure.
made it happen. So,
Habla español?
no,
Okay. Okay, so it was good. It was good.
me español no bueno.
Okay, excellent. I have to ask, and
Hmm.
I don't want to send this off in a dark way, but did the Wahoo survive?
I don't know. I don't
Okay.
know. And so my boat, I was with three other people who were doing this orca snorkeling tour.
Yeah.
And so three of us were indifferent to the fate of the Wahoo. One of the people on the boat was very pro Wahoo. Um,
Okay.
and I mean, so for me, like the way I look at it is a false killer whale is an advanced mammal. It's a pretty intelligent mammal. I'd rather that they eat and survive
Yeah.
than the wahoo. I don't really care about the wahoo. It's just a dumb
Yeah.
fish, right?
Yeah. Well, and plus they were hunting in a pack, right? There were three of
Yeah.
them. That'd be a tough to get away from. Hey,
Yeah.
Michael in Rwanda asked about composition.
Mm.
Underwater composition is challenging. Any suggestions on how to get better composition when photographing underwater?
Well, so the principles of composition are the same above water as they are underwater, as far as I'm concerned. Whatever type of photography you're doing, thinking about visual design doesn't really change. Like landscape maybe is a little bit different than wildlife, for example, but I tend to use the same principles no matter what photography I'm doing. The challenge of underwater composition is not that there's any unique design principles that you got to keep in mind. It's a pragmatic challenge. It is so difficult to get your eye to the viewfinder, especially when things are fast moving. When things slow down, then you can get your eye to the viewfinder and you can actually think about composition. But when they're moving fast, as I said, you're often just putting the camera housing in front of you and hoping you've got it aimed properly
Right.
at the species that you're photographing. And
Wow.
then you're just firing, you're literally shooting from the hip.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I have some ideas in mind. Like, for example, I know if I can get down a little bit lower with either the camera housing, like you can hold the camera housing lower and try to get more of an upward angle. Like, for example, with let me just go back to one of the sea turtle shots. Give me a moment to find it. So, like here, for example,
Yeah.
turtle was at the top of the water. I didn't dive down for this shot, but I basically just held my camera housing down as far as I could beneath me and then angled it up.
Oh,
So I
wow.
was guessing about the proper composition here. And it turned
It,
out to be a pretty good guess.
That's a cool shot. And that you raise a good point. How buoyant is the camera housing once you pressurized it with the air inside? Are you struggling to keep it underwater?
It does have buoyancy. It's got positive buoyancy. You can neutralize that by adding dive weights to it. So you can
Mm,
actually neutralize its buoyancy. But the positive buoyancy isn't so challenging that you
okay.
can't easily hold the camera underwater.
Muscle it down. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
the only time I didn't use weights on my camera housing. The one time I wish I had is when I was in the water with the silky sharks because I was in the water for an hour and by the end of the hour, my arms were getting really tired trying to hold that housing
Mhm.
down without that neutral buoyancy. So you can neutralize the buoyancy of it.
Right, right. How heavy overall was the camera in the, outside of the water? A few pounds?
Yeah, I would say like the camera and the lens is maybe like 3 pounds total, very lightweight, but the housing probably weighs more like 4 or 5 pounds.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, it's somewhere between like 7 and 10 pounds overall.
Right.
Yeah.
I did like your comments earlier about underwater composition elements, including the light rays
Mhm.
and kind of framing with other animals, and in that one shot with the the killer whale coming down with a little bubble off at the fin. I thought there were so many kind of lines and angles and cool stuff to look at there that you really get an eye for it, and even the reflections. Yeah, see, I love that. I mean, there's just so much going on there. Just a fabulous shot. It,
Yeah, like on the one hand, it's sometimes really difficult to be present in the moment, to be thinking about these things.
mhm, mhm,
But what I try to do is I analyze the photos I'm taking and I think critically about what's good and what's not good.
mhm,
And so I'm thinking, okay, well, I definitely want the sun rays, for example. So I know that I need to figure out a way to incorporate those in a composition. I know that you can get the
right.
reflection of the animal at the top of the water
Yeah,
with certain circumstances. And so even when I'm shooting from the hip, I am thinking about these things and trying to incorporate them as
right,
best I
right,
can. And there is that extra advantage to shooting wide angle with a high megapixel camera is that you've got some room for creative recropping later to
right,
get the framing exactly the way you want it. So when
right,
you're shooting from the hip, chances are you're not going to get it perfect. Chances are you're going to make a mistake and have your positioning a little bit off. And so I've got the flexibility to crop it later to get everything positioned the way I want it to. This is something I think that's generally good for wildlife photography is to
hmm,
shoot a little bit wider, a little bit loose. Because when
hmm,
you're on the land, sometimes the animals will unpredictably move,
right,
and you don't want to like cut off the wing of the bird you're photographing at the image edge or something like that. So a little bit wider framing so that you
hmm.
can crop it a bit later is a good strategy generally for wildlife.
See, all that wildlife photography on land really helped you underwater as well. That's
By
great.
comparison, wildlife photography on land is super easy and very, very safe. I
Yeah, there's
mean,
not
yeah.
apex predators running around all over the place.
Yeah, like, every time I've been on an African safari, I've been in a safari vehicle or, photographing polar bears up in the Alaskan Arctic. I've been in a boat or like a four by four vehicle. So there's never any chance that the animal was going to come and eat me. And I have had like close encounters with potentially dangerous animals like mountain gorillas.
Oh
There's
wow.
nothing protecting you, but they're not predators. They're not particularly aggressive. They
Mm,
might just try to show their dominance and, throw a stick at you or push you over or something like that. But they're not going to, just charge you and start ripping your arms and legs off. Um,
oh boy.
and so definitely in the water, like I never felt unsafe, but if you like when I was on the trip, I was too busy to think about it.
Yeah,
Usually it's just like the captain says jump, you jump in the water, and then the captain says come back, and you're back in, and you don't have a chance to think about it. It was afterwards when I got back home
yeah.
and I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, and I realized, what the hell was I thinking? This was insane.
I've heard you say on a number of occasions, yeah, I didn't feel unsafe at the time, and I'm thinking, why on earth didn't you feel unsafe at the moment you're jumping in the water with predator sharks? It's fantastic. It's like you shut off that lizard brain part of your.
Yes, you never have a chance to turn it on. When things are happening so quickly, you never really have a chance to think about it. That said, I don't want to freak people out.
Yeah,
This was perfectly safe. I
yeah,
never felt like I was in an unsafe situation at all. And there are people who, like these tours, they take people out to snorkel with silky sharks all the time.
yeah,
Certain species I'd be really nervous about being in the water with. Great white shark, for example. You
yeah.
couldn't pay me enough to go in
Not
without a
even
suit
with a
of armor.
cage. Oh boy. That's yeah, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking it's like a Powerball statistics problem, right? They
Exactly.
take so many tourists out there. What are the odds it's going to be you? Uh,
Well, so another way to think about it is that, yeah, there is always a small risk that something's going to happen. I mean, I've heard stories of people who were on safaris in Africa who had their arm leaning out the window and a lion comes up and grabs it, pulls them out and kills them. I mean, it happens.
it does
Every
happen.
now and then, weird things happen, but your chances of having something bad happening to you doing one of these things is probably a lot less than
Right.
your chances of having something bad happen to you when you're driving your car. Just
Yeah.
generally, that's probably the least safe thing that you do in your entire lifetime, and you do it all the time and never think about it. So
Well,
I think that's a good way of putting
I
in
think that's a
perspective.
great way. As a motorcycle rider, I can appreciate that. Um, Michael has a question, and then we'll start to wind this down here a little bit. So he asked, "Do you use a dome on the housing for the lens to allow for a split water or sky shots?"
Okay, so yes, I do use a dome on the housing. So a
Oh,
dome on the housing
that,
is helpful in two situations. One, if you want to do any split under over
right.
shots, which I wasn't doing, but that is a possibility. The other thing that you want a dome for is that if you use a flat port on your housing, you end up essentially cropping the image because the water has a multiplier effect unless you've got a dome. So the dome allows you to preserve the native focal length you're working with. So I think it's like about a 25% crop that if you use a flat port. And so your 16 millimeter lens becomes more like a 20,
Right.
or a 22 millimeter lens or something like that, depending on how much that effective crop is. So the
So you're
dome
shooting through a
port,
dome surface.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And my understanding is that the dome puts more air between the lens and the water, and that's
Mhm.
what prevents that magnification effect that you otherwise get in the water. And that's why you need the dome for those split shots, because half the camera is above the water, the other half is below the water. The part that's below the water has that magnification effect, unless you've got the dome.
Yeah, yeah. Great question. Great question. Well, Ian, I think I can speak for certainly Sam and I and the rest of the audience here when I say this was a fascinating talk. I mean, to be able to see live video, the resulting shots from what looked like, you know, kind of a gray, and like you say, the water quality was different in a variety of days. Just a fascinating talk, and I definitely learned a lot. Thinking back to my own Baja experiences, I realized that I need more than my iPhone in a water sealed bag. How you're going to cost me a lot of money, bud.
That's what I'm
But
here
thank you.
for.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing all your great shots and your wisdom with us. Always appreciate it, my friend.
Thank you so much. Always fun to sit down and talk with you guys. And thank you everyone for joining me. I hope to see you guys all again, either virtually or even better in real life. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.